And welcome to the second instalment in Pop Screen's Bowie month, tracking the screen career of one David Jones. We are the Geek Show podcast that likes to deal with the good, the bad, and the bizarre of movies either starring by or about pop stars, covering a range of musical and cinematic genres from country and western to hip-hop, documentaries to science fiction. I'm your host, Graham Williamson. I'm a writer for The Geek Show and Horrified.com, the British horror website. And I've been joined this week by...
Mark Cunliffe. I'm also a writer for The Geek Show, as well as We Are Cult. I've had some film essays published for Arrow Films. Got another one coming up at the moment, which I have to be top secret about. So there's a bit of a spoiler there. And I've also wrote a chapter in Scarred for Life, Volume 2, about 80s television series Casualty.
Excellent. So this week, you wanted to welcome in, didn't you, Mark?
I did, yes. Seeing as we're talking about Bowie and Baal, I thought I'd join in with a suitably suitable tribute for him, which goes a bit like this. Hang on a minute. Graham and Mark are talking about Baal. Directed by Alan Clarke. Starring David Bowie. It must be Pop Screen.
Lovely. I had actually had the exact same idea.
Hey, brilliant.
Which is uncanny.
That is so spooky.
Whilst Pop Screen announced a Bowie month, even then the first film was a popular one, with Christian Bale and Hugh Jackman too. Now we're back to punish you.
Fantastic. I was going to try and find my fly swatter. I've got one of those electronic fly swatters. Don't get that out, but you've got the whole distance with the guitar, even better.
Well, I feel like no one can do it properly because no one in the history of the world has ever had a banjo that looks like Bowie's banjo in Baal.
No, that is very true. Apparently it was a very vintage one, and he didn't know how to play it, which kind of comes across in the film itself, doesn't it?
I just assumed that was method bad banjo playing, but yeah, possibly. Maybe not. Yes. This is Baal, which for listeners who were unaware, and I'm thinking that's got to be quite a few listeners, right?
Yeah, I would think so. It's a rarity.
We are doing Labyrinth later on in the month, but this ain't Labyrinth.
Although a few Muppets would have enlivened it a bit, perhaps.
Well, Baal is one of those plays which would work very well in a Muppet version, isn't it? If you had like Baal as the only human and everyone around him, there's like Dr. Bunsen Honeydew in Weimar in your outfit saying, Baal, this new song of yours is absolutely terrible.
Because you could have Oscar the Grouch as Baal, couldn't you?
You could have Baal playing to Waldorf and Statler, and it would only slightly change the tone of the drama.
Only slightly be different. Apart from him taking people's virginity, I think that's the only thing that would scare off Disney, really.
Yes. But this was a TV movie that Bowie made in 1982. We have Letterboxd's prime cataloguer of British one-off play strands here with us this week. So what was this part of? Was it part of any sort of wider series?
I don't think it was, no. I may be wrong, but it's at the time it was like play for today, play of the month, play of the week. And I don't think it was any of those categories at all. I think it was just we have a budget and we have an hour's television to fill. So it was just a one-off play. Yeah.
Right, right. Because this is done by arguably the greatest talent, directorially speaking, to come up through those plays, which is Alan Clarke. Show
My
the viewers
favourite.
at home your T-shirt, Mark.
Hey, da-da.
Smashing.
Yeah, one of my favourites, Clarkey. Mike Leigh, Ken Loach, Alan Clarke. That's the holy trinity for me.
It's yeah, and I mean, anyone who's listened as far back as Cinema Eclectica will know that me and you have very different opinions on British social realist stuff.
We
most
do,
of the time.
yeah, but we still get on.
We just, yeah. The thing is, the point I'm making, even I love Alan Clarke. He was great. Yeah,
that's it. That's the main thing. Yeah, that's what we take from this today.
Yes. And by this point, he'd established himself pretty well, hadn't he? He'd spent the 60s and 70s building up an impressive sort of canon of material, culminating in his play which ended the 70s, which was Scum, which also unexpectedly provided him a way into theatrical release movies when the BBC banned that play and it had to be remade and put out as a movie instead.
Yeah, it was a case of necessity, wasn't it? It was basically just let's remake the play that nobody's ever going to see, never ever going to see. That's what they thought at the time, into a cinematic feature, which kind of, it's almost like the second act for Clarke, really, at that point, because as you say, he's done from the 60s through to the 70s as a, you know, he's made a good name for himself. He's caught, you know, the eye of the audience and the critics alike. He's created a few enemies in television, just generally with his behaviour.
Yes.
I mean, he was never the wing commander type that the BBC liked at that time. You know, the Blazers and what have you. He was banned. He was famously banned from the BBC Club. And also, apparently, is the only person to be banned from using the lifts at BBC Television Centre as well.
That's extraordinary. What could happen? Dare I ask what could happen?
I have no idea. I do know. I mean, just to distract from that slightly, is round about this time, actually, 1982, the young ones were invited to the BBC Christmas comedy party. They would basically just do a party for the comedy department, and all the famous people who had worked at the comedy department and all the crew and what have you would all get together for a shindig. Memorably, Alexei Sale says that Monty Python were banned from a Christmas party because they wore jeans. But what the young ones got up to that day was even worse, because
even worse than wearing jeans.
Even worse than wearing jeans, yeah. Because there's an amusing one where I'm going off piste already. There's an amusing one where Alexei Sale was introduced to Kenny Everett by Jim Moyer, who was then head of BBC Comedy. I said, "Oh, you'll know who this man is, won't you?" Because they're thinking they're both comedians, they're both from Liverpool, but one grew up as a Marxist, the other one was a staunch conservative.
Yes.
And Alexei Sale said, "Yes, I know who that is," and proceeded to blank him and just walk past. But Jim Moore later said that effect didn't really register with him. He just thought it was some kind of homosexual spat. But the real problem happened in the lifts television centre when Roland Rivron decided to show Mrs. Valdoonican his penis.
As one does, right? Yes.
I don't think he got banned from the lifts at BBC TV Centre. So, what Clarkey got up to, who knows?
Yeah.
But yeah, he was forced to use the stairs all the time.
That feels like a very class-bound punishment, doesn't it? Being forced to use stairs.
Well, yeah, I suppose given his sort of rather notorious poor dress sense and possible hygiene standards, perhaps they were just like, we can't have him in a small confinement like the lift.
It's possibly true, yeah. Maybe BBC Television Centre didn't really have an asbestos scare in the late 80s. Maybe they were just thinking, oh, we need to get Clarkey out of a studio and into somewhere with fresh air for once. How can we do this?
That would be true. Although the famous occasion in the 70s when they did get him in fresh air, sent him to Halifax to make Horace, and he was there for 3 hours, at which point, after 3 hours, he had tipped over the grill in the hotel restaurant because he'd had a fight with the hotel owner. Got carted off to the police station, didn't like the way that the arresting officer was standing a bit too close to him, told him, if you keep getting that close to me, you'll regret it, and proceeded to punch his lights out.
It's a real wonder how this guy, managed to direct Scum so well, isn't it? How did he get inside those young offenders' heads? It's a mystery.
I love the line that the magistrate apparently said to Mr. Clarke, how long had you been in Halifax before this happened? He said, about 3 hours. I said, how long do you intend to stay in Halifax? He said, about 3 weeks. But yeah, this was very much the second stage of Clarke's career, which is a very interesting one, because although what we've just painted was a sort of maverick genius, he was genuinely well regarded as a man who could tackle most forms of drama and, provide some good plaudits and acclaim for the work he put out. But from about this point onwards, 1982, I think some of his Brechtian influence starts to come to the fore, because he's very interested in alienation.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily the alienation that Brecht would use, which would be, to always make the audience aware that they're watching a performance. His was more a case of, let's make that whole thing really alienating. Let's make it to the point where you think, what am I watching? Is this worth watching?
Yeah.
What is this strange thing that's happening before me?
And it all culminates in Elephant, which I think was the penultimate thing he completed before he died. And
it's either that or the Firm.
I always get mixed up. I think I read some other people say it was the Firm, but in a strange way, Elephant always feels like the end point to me, because it's the most pared back example of his particular style you could imagine.
Because he was stripped by the 80s. He was stripping everything out of the work he was doing. I think when you consider the three most alienating pieces like that is Contact, Christine, and then Elephant.
Yeah.
And I know that Contact in particular, and I think Christine as well, actually I think Elephant too, I think they all originally had stories with dialogue and narrative, and he just ripped pages out of the script. We don't need that. Because he could do it all with just atmosphere, looks, famously shooting actors from miles away during Contact. So you're just getting an actor's natural reaction, which again doesn't sound very Brecht, because Brecht is all about performance. It's epic theatre. It's making sure that the audience are aware that they're watching a performance. This is catching people unawares to create a performance, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, I think when we talk, I realise that Brechtian alienation effects is one of those phrases that just makes people want to die. And if you're one of those listeners, I'm very sorry about that. But it's important to note that when we talk about Brecht as being someone who was interested in performance, it's not in the way that a conventional drama is interested in performance, where you're meant to think, oh, I really feel for that person. I really want them to win at whatever it is they're doing. Brecht wasn't averse to that, but he also wanted you to step back and look at how this applies to the world outside the theatre as well.
That's right, yeah. It was... I mean, the one thing I've been listening to recently was a podcast with Alexei Sale, where they're actually talking about Brecht.
Oh, yeah.
Because apparently somebody said, tell me about Brecht, because, you often mention him. So he got a Brecht expert in to talk about it. I think it was out last week, this podcast.
Is that the Alexei Sale podcast, the one that he
That's
does?
the very one, yeah. So I think it's called Jingle Jangle, that particular episode, because apparently that was a low rent kind of Weimar Republic cabaret at the time. You had the cabarets, and
Was
then you had
it?
the something called the Jingle Jangle, I think it was called, which is slightly more
Even more sinister now, I
even
would say.
more sinister, down at heel, low rent, experimental than even the cabarets, which just
Yes.
you know it sounds very baffling. But yeah, I mean, one of the things they said that just reminded me of Baal actually was they said Brecht has no grasp of geography in the sense that he would say a place but not necessarily know where that place was.
Yeah. And you can see, there are Brecht plays that are set in America, there are Brecht plays that are set in China, in Italy, all over the world, but they are all fundamentally set on stage. They are even
Yeah,
less realistic in their depictions of
it's
these
like
places than Shakespeare
absolutely,
was.
absolutely. It's like putting a pin in a map and saying, right, I'll say that. And it sounds like a fantastical place because it's just beyond, it's like saying Timbuktu, I suppose, is our nearest
Yeah.
equivalent, really. But although that sounds fantastical, he's centering something that the audience should think, oh yeah, this is like what we're going through now. This is life that we're going through now. Even though it's a performance, even though it's in a fantastical place, there's a grain of truth to everything that I can take home and consider about society in a wider context.
And one of those early exotic plays that he wrote was The Rise and Fall of the City of Mahogany, which includes the song Alabama Song, which was covered by
David Bowie.
No, sorry, the right answer is The Doors. Yes, it was covered by David Bowie in a song that he recorded to fill out his RCA contract. That is, I mean, I think it's fantastic, but listeners, if you've never had a panic attack, why not listen to David Bowie's version of Alabama Song, and you'll understand exactly what it's like.
Yeah, that sounds about right, actually. Yeah, that's
It's
true.
terrifying, isn't
Yeah,
it?
that's one of the things that first turned me on about Bowie as a teenager. Though, was it's just like, what is this weird sort of soundscapes that I'm hearing? And it's like I don't like it, but I feel compelled to keep listening to it. And it's like Stuart Lee said about the fall, isn't it? It's not nice to listen to, but you feel compelled to keep going. It's like having really bad medicine, isn't it? And just constantly I will get better if I just listen to this.
The amazing thing is about Baal that I don't know if Clarke did, but his producer, Lewis Marks, who, as we know, also the writer of several Doctor Who stories.
Yes.
Yeah. Had no idea that Bowie had any interest in Brecht.
No, that's right. Originally, Clarke wanted Stephen Berkoff, but I think Marx sort of dissuaded him of that because I think the argument was Berkoff was too class-centric an actor, and it would ground it in a very English way to do with our class system, as opposed to Bavarian society before World War One, which is when Baal was presumably set, I think.
Yes.
It's around about that era, isn't it?
It was completed in 1919, but it's set, I think, before World War One.
Yeah.
That's correct.
I think it didn't get put on stage till about 23 or something like that. It's technically, it might be his first play, I'm not sure.
His first sort of, I mean, I'm sure he wrote stuff when he was a kid, but his first proper play.
Yeah.
And it's an odd piece of work, I think.
Oh,
interesting, but very strange.
Yeah, I mean, there's some interesting choices that Clarke makes that I'm sure we'll get onto. But yeah, I'm not a big fan of it, as we've discussed in private previously. This is an interesting one for me to talk about. I think I'm primarily here because I love Alan Clarke, but even for me, this is quite low down on my appreciation of Clarke's work, really.
I think I have a warm feeling towards it because the first time I watched it was straight after Bowie died. And you watch it in that context and you think, as you do now to a lesser extent, but you think, oh God, there's no one in the world now who would do something like this. There's no one in the world who would think of it, who would pull it off so well. This is what we've lost. I think rewatching it, yes, I can see that there are many flaws in it. It certainly isn't anything close to, Road or Elephant or Pender's Fen or all those other truly great Alan Clarke works. But
Yeah.
I do find it a really fascinating and unusual piece of work.
It's very unusual and it's very fascinating. Yeah. If it's good, is a different question. But that's the thing, isn't it? Again, it's that idea of like, this is weird, but somehow it's stimulating, and I must see more of it to see what they're not easy gifts to an audience, but they're nourishing.
And they weren't
But
at the time either. I mean,
no, not at all. No.
As we've discussed with Privilege before, it is tempting to look back at stuff like this and think, oh God, you'd never get something like this made today. And you think, well, they barely got it made then, to be honest.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I mean, the BBC must have been amazed that, like you say, it must have been wonderful to find out that Bowie is into Brecht and German expressionism, because it just seems like a fortuitous moment. But I mean, you've just got the biggest rock star on the planet to play a lead in an hour's piece of television. I mean, that's pretty incredible, really.
Anyone else would insist that the result should be commercial in some way.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah. But then we're talking about the BBC, who sort of, gave the Beatles how much to do Magical Mystery Tour for the same sort of length. Look what happened there. but it's a good choice. I mean, I get where Clarke was coming from with Berkhoff, but I think Bowie's a better choice, because I think even Bowie would be the first to admit he's not an actor.
I think he has given great performances, and some of them
absolutely
have been transformative ones. But I think, as with pop stars in movies in general, you have to allow for the fact that there are some people in the audience who are just going to sit back and go, that's David Bowie, in a way that they never would with Steven Berkhoff.
That's true, but that works brilliantly in a Brecht terms here, because again, you're always supposed to remember that you're seeing an actor, or you're seeing a person playing a character. I mean, again, going back to the Alexei Sayle podcast, the guy, I can't remember the guy's name now, but he was saying that one of the things that Brecht always wanted was sort of anecdotal acting. If I was to tell you today that I fell over in the park, which I legitimately did, I was walking the dog and something flashed out from the bushes and the dog went for it. And I went straight with it. So the dog's went, and I went, and landed flat on my face. I picked myself up, and that. It's that kind of anecdotal sort of acting that I've just had to do a dog impression. I've had to do that. Oh, I fell over. You put voices on, you might say, I then bumped into the neighbor who's like, oh, look at the state of you. What have you done? You're doing that voice automatically, aren't you?
Yeah.
Sometimes you don't even know you're doing it. That was sort of Brecht's end goal in terms of performance, really, apparently, that he wanted that kind of, almost like you just putting clothing on and then dispensing with it straight away. So the audience is always aware that it's a performance going before them.
And it's a strange thing. I mean, it would be impossible to do in television now, because television now, I find, is maddeningly obsessed with this quality that they call cinematic, which to me has nothing to do with cinema. It's just about it being glossy and naturalistic.
Yeah.
And everything in Baal and everything in Brecht is against that.
Yeah. I mean, this wouldn't get made today at all.
No.
I mean, you mentioned Doctor Who there, and we've talked about how television was 40 years ago. It was shot as theatre. So you would have people performing with the backs to the back of the wall, the set wall, facing out to the perceived audience, and the four banks of cameras that are capturing the action, so that you get very odd, unnatural kind of I mean, the best example is Doctor Who, isn't it? When you think of the TARDIS console, is just like that, isn't it? You don't see that bit, but you do see that bit there, and then you've got the console in the middle, and like the Doctor would be stood there, and then you get his companions sort of stood either side like that, but they're playing out slightly towards the audience. it's just very unnatural. People would literally walk. It's like I see now with COVID, when you're aware of certain dramas that are
Yeah.
made under COVID conditions, you watching, like Doctors is brilliant for it. I don't
Mm.
know if anybody watches the mind-numbingly dull but curiously addictive afternoon drama Doctors, because you watch people who's supposed to be family, and one will walk in and one finds one sat at the TV, and instead of sitting down on the sofa next to them or going standing right up to them like an ordinary family do, they're 2 meters apart.
Yeah.
So it's like, what are you doing? Oh, I'm doing this. It's just so weird, and it is a very unnatural kind of way to present stuff, which you just don't see apart from COVID restrictions. You don't see on television anymore. This example was determinedly shot like that.
Mm.
The first scene in particular, apart from Bowie, hammering
Singing
away
the
at the
first bit of,
banjo,
yeah.
the first scene where he's being courted by the middle class elite, and
Mm.
he's just happy to feed his face, and just sort of
Yeah.
like swat past questions and ignore them, and generally just only pay attention when the pretty daughter arrives. It's shot as if you're like in row 4 of a theatre.
Mm.
I mean, you've got David Bowie, and you can barely see him. There's no close-ups. Everything
Yeah.
is shot in such a distance, and it is that kind of, well, this was cabaret. So, from Clarke's point of view, I think he is conscious of what an audience in a theatre might have seen, and it is
Yeah.
just shot like that
And
repeatedly, really.
and it is deliberate. I mean, you can compare it to some of the very early stuff he did, which also have that theatrical look, because back in the 60s, everything had that theatrical look on television. But around this time, he's making stuff like Contacts, you mentioned. He's making stuff like
Yeah.
Beloved Enemy, which have much more use of location work and actually cinematic style, a style that actually looks like cinema rather than just being over budget, which is what cinematic means now.
Yeah.
But so this is a massive step away from that style he's developing at the moment.
Yeah, he's becoming more interested in.
The steady cam is the huge thing.
I mean, they're a fascinating generation that came up in the BBC at that time, really.
Yeah.
And they're all a bit like magpies, in the sense that they will sort of see what the other one's doing and sort of copy it slightly. You'd seen Stephen Frears' Walter, which used Steadicam, and he was just bowled over by it, and that became his big thing, really. The constantly moving. He made what he called walking movies, and if you see anything from Road onwards, really, the walking movies. People remember the Steadicam shot of in Rita Sue and Bob 2, and Leslie Sharp in Road. Yeah, you can hear the feet.
Yeah,
I mean, Leslie Sharp apparently walked something like 16 miles that day, just wandering round and round this wasteland.
Incredible.
Yeah. It's really fascinating. But he was just obsessed with just capturing movement on screen. With this, I think he'd looked at what John McGrath was doing on BBC. John McGrath of the 784 Theatre Company. He'd just done 2 Play for Today's, 2 sequels called The Adventures of Frank. So there's The Adventures of Frank Part 1 and Adventures of Frank's Part 2. And that was using what was very popular at the time, which is Quantel graphics, which of course he uses here. And the way that, again, that Brecht thing of breaking the fourth wall. So we'll do it in a way that is very state-of-the-art computer graphics. So you're making use of the fact that this is an artificial scenario to just, it's like you see in Brecht, it's in Baal, it's memorably that he's against this sort of like white background, isn't he?
Yeah.
So you just feel like this is the TV bit, this is the artificial bit when he talks to the camera, and the way they use the split screen, and sometimes it's a static photo while he's talking, and other times you might see him and Jonathan Kent, his co-star, walking. Again, motion on camera, even though they're not walking anywhere, it's the scenery moving behind them. It is that motion thing that he's so fascinated in.
And those split screen segments, I think, are the real triumph of the show. They remind you of that famous story about Lev Kuleshov, the Soviet editor, where he got a photograph of a very famous actor and spliced it into some footage and, cut from the photograph to a bowl of soup, cut from the photograph to a woman's face. And the audience would watch it and say, he's clearly portraying hunger. He's clearly portraying heartbreak, but it was the same image every single time.
Yeah.
The editing creates context, and Clarke manages to do that here with split screen, with the close-up of Bowie singing The Drowned Girl, and with the close-up of, is it Tracy Fields who plays that character of her face?
Tracy Childs, I think.
Tracy Childs, that's her name.
Later in Howard's Way.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah.
I mean, there are some remarkable before they were famous finds here, aren't they? Because the other woman in Baal's life is a very young Zoe Wanamaker.
Zoe Wanamaker, yeah. Julian Wadham, who's still consistently working. If you ever need a slightly older English gentleman, it seems to be Julian Wadham. I think he's now steed in Big Finish Avengers audios, I think now. Right. So yeah, he's Baal's mate who Baal subsequently does the dirty on quite early on.
Yeah, he's really striking in this, isn't he?
Yeah,
I mean, anyone in a film with David Bowie is going to take the second most intense close-ups in the film, but Wadham gets close here, I reckon.
It does, yeah. I mean, they are it's a good cast. I think he always knew how to cast things well, Clarke. Yeah. He always got a really good ensemble. There's never really much call for somebody who doesn't seem to be getting what's going on.
Yeah.
You always, even with some really good play for today's, if you look at drama that's been made at that time, you might see one person who thinks they didn't quite get the memo, but it doesn't seem to be a problem when Clarke's doing something. But people, despite what in-house feelings that the BBC might have been about him, people who actually worked with him on the floor usually had nothing but praise for him.
Yeah.
Even though he did some pretty awful things to people. Like the most famous one is Scum, where he sort of like lined up the actors and then lined up the black kids, for the murder ball scene. The black kids were just locals apparently. Right. And he got between both groups, and he'd go up to the black kids and go, "These are calling you something awful, these are not Ponzi actors, you've got to show them, you're going hard on these." Then he'd go up to the actors and go, they're really going to fucking murder you here. He was all about dissent and just trying to get something really exciting on screen. Definitely.
And I think that's why he has this incredible track record, doesn't he, of discovering new talent.
Yeah. And you think of people like Tim Roth and Gary Oldman and what have you, they will still, and Janine Duvitsky as well, memorably starring Diane, they will still speak incredibly highly of him, incredibly highly.
Yeah.
I do wonder how much Clarke saw in the character, of himself in the character of Baal as well, because it's that kind of scruffy genius that sort of people want to run to, but also are also repelled by as well.
It's strange, isn't it? Because you can sense a lot of different angles on Baal. A lot of the creators seem to be pulling in different directions in a way that I think is really productive, because Brecht was inspired to write this by a play called The Loner by Hans Jost, which I haven't read. Reportedly, it's very sentimental kind of German romanticism about a dissolute poet who repents on his deathbed and sees the error of his ways. So part of what Baal is just razzing that, really, about a dissolute poet who continues being a fucking arsehole until he falls over dead, which is quite funny. But there's some other context that I think can be quite misleading, which is that Jost, in his later career, would go on to write propaganda for the Nazis, and Brecht, in his later career, famously wouldn't. So it has that air of being kind of a warning tremor of Nazism, but I don't think Baal himself is a Hitler analog, really. I think it's more about trying to find the rotten underbelly of that kind of sentimental, bucolic, happy dancing peasants Germany that the Nazis used as propaganda, rather than saying, that this guy is, he's not Steerpike in Gormenghast. He's not meant to be analogous to Hitler in that way.
No, I mean, I was just about to come up with a phrase, but sometimes it's a phrase that you sort of go into dark and disturbing waters with, because now it's become a context. When you hear this phrase now, it's like an apologist for racism. But Baal is a character in my mind that will call a spade a spade. Now, when you hear that phrase now, you're automatically thinking of some gammon wanker who just doesn't like the fact that he can't call,
Oh, they can say it in their rap records, but
exactly,
I can't.
Exactly. Or even down to, as we're recording this now, the Jubilee weekend has finally left us, thank fuck.
Yes.
But apparently Len Goodman got several sort of complaints at the BBC, didn't he, for saying foreign muck. Yeah. So again, that to people who would defend Len Goodman for that, they'll say he's just calling a spade a spade. His mum didn't like foreign cuisine, It's not a racist term, but so I'm always a bit when you use that phrase, calling a spade. But Baal is that character who would. It's the Emperor's New Clothes type of character, isn't it? He points at the pomposity and the petty manners and morality of society at the time, which includes that whole sickening heap of sentimentalism that was just sort of like rife in sort of Bavarian Germanic society, really.
Marvelously, Brecht's working title for one of the early songs he sings, Remembering Marie, was Sentimental Song number 1004, which is very much the tenor of the thing, I think.
You wouldn't think he went to write the Threepenny Opera, would you?
No.
But I mean, there's a lot of stuff talked about Brecht, and I'm in no way an expert on him at all. But like you said earlier, a lot of people are like, oh shit, the minute you hear stuff like, epic theatre, alienation technique, blah, 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 blah. The crucial kernel of information really with Brecht is that whatever he's doing, it's in opposition to what's going on at the time, I think.
Yeah.
So he's seen the way that sentimentality is on the rise after the First World War. They're always sort of like trying to look back to a sort of golden era that probably never existed anyway, which is kind of what we're doing now.
It has a certain, that kind of reactionary sentimentality does feel very topical again, doesn't it?
And the worrying thing is, of course, with the benefit of history, we can see where that worrying sentimentality went to in Germany, and shit, it might go here as well.
Yeah. But it is like that thing, isn't it, where there's this constant rumbling on scandal about the airlifting of animals out of Kabul. Yeah. And the sort of person that is intended to impress the sort of Ricky Gervais type people who go on and on about the little baby animals with the sprained legs, but when you get them onto actual human beings suffering, not asked, mate. Should have thought of that before they became disabled, shouldn't they?
Yeah. Don't even start me on Ricky Gervais.
Yeah.
Currently, I think it's my now. I mean, I've been on Letterboxd for 11 years this year, and I've watched my review of Gervais's last comedy act rocket up to about 4th popular review I've ever written.
You must have been sitting there thinking, if I'd have known the secret to this was just calling Ricky Gervais a dickhead, I would have been happy to do that.
I'd have done it even when he was funny then. I'd have just anything to get noticed,
Yeah, it's true what you say about Baal in Clarke's version being a character who is someone you find yourself drawn to despite his repellence and despite the unforgivable things he does.
He gets your vote, doesn't he, in the
Mm.
long run? Whether that's intentional to the source material, I'm not entirely sure.
I think it has. I think it's appropriate because I think what Brecht is always writing about is not so much a character but a system. And I think you could stage a version of Baal that had a properly repulsive Baal that everyone in the audience would go out hating, but the audience should go out hating the people who pander to him and hypocritically repelled when he starts to behave like an arse.
Yeah, that's true.
Those are the villains, not
him. It's pointing a finger at society, which I think both Brecht and Clarke did very well. I mean, Clarke's apparently famous mantra on set was let's get the pig out, let's get a good look at it, and then let's kill it.
Yeah.
And the pig is sort of like society in that term, really. But it's interesting, and it sort of just occurred to me then when I said he gets your vote and whether that is right for the source material, because Rita Sue and Bob 2 is a good example of that, in the sense that Bob becomes a hero that you want to somehow win the day, which is very hard now for younger generation, or this present generation, to watch, because he's a fucking paedophile.
Yeah.
He's a middle-aged man with 2 schoolgirls, and that is never going to sit well in society now. But at the time, and it didn't even then. I mean, Andrea Dunbar famously hated what Clarke did with Rita Sue and Bob 2, because her conclusion to her original play ends completely differently. It just sort of ends with the women really talking about how men will always fuck you over, whereas Clarke's film is like he's back in the bosom of his 2 young girls. You know, he goes to bed, he goes upstairs, gets to the bed, and they're both in there waiting for him when he thought that they dumped him.
And it's weird, isn't it, Rita Sue and Bob 2? Because it seems to be the one Clarke film which does like get to people who were not going to it for the politics. I know the tagline was Thatcher's Britain with its knickers down, which is a great tagline, but it feels like even more so than something like Scum, people will watch Rita Sue and Bob 2 in a quite apolitical frame of mind, in a way that they obviously never will with, you know, Elephant or something.
They go to it for the bawdy comedy and the funny northern accents, really. It's almost Carry On, isn't it, really? But Clarke was always Clarke wasn't a middle-class filmmaker. You know, he wanted the working class to watch what he did. So, I mean, he famously used to say that, I think somebody came in on set one day with like The Guardian or The Independent, you know, a whole stack of newspapers, and he'd sort of say, you know, they need to read the fucking Sun. You know? Get everything you want out of that. You know?
Yeah,
which from Scouse, I mean, obviously it's before Hillsborough, is it?
Yeah, Danny Boyle told that one.
Yeah. They need the fucking Sun. Everything's in there. But of course, it's before Hillsborough, so I suppose
slightly more forgivable. Yes,
exactly. Now you sort of you'd have to take the context, but again,
that is meant to be a challenge, isn't it? You are meant to go a bit to that, aren't you?
And there's a part where you think, is he just trolling you?
Yeah.
Or is he just, you know, or does he genuinely mean that? But I think a lot of it is trolling, but I think it's a way that he kept his finger on the pulse of what his audiences wanted. I don't think Clarke would have read this. I don't think for 1 second Clarke would have voted Conservative, put it that way. And I don't think he would for 1 second have picked up the Sun and read all the sort of Murdoch flag waving of Thatcher at that time and think, yeah, that's all you need in life, you know, because it's interesting to point out that, especially in this context now, we're talking about Baal, this stage of his sort of career, he's more interested in alienating people at a time when his core audience felt alienated by what was going on in the country. So I think that the feelings of his core audience definitely come into play with what he's doing with screenplays at that time, to just dispense with scripts and structural narrative and just say, I can do it with movement, I can do it with certain shocking scenes like Elephant, because it's just one after the other, isn't it?
Yeah.
Or Christine, just watching young children just shoot up while children's television plays in the background. These are shocking scenes, and it is supposed to repel, because these people are disenfranchised. So it becomes almost like filmmaking of disenfranchisement.
Yeah, and I think it also links in, I mean, particularly with Christine, it links into what he's seeing going on in the country in general. And this is easier to see when you look at his work in the context of those astonishingly good BFI box sets that came out a few years back of all this TV work that survives. You look at his early plays, you look at something like Sovereign's Company, and it's a play about an institution. It's a play about a particular institution, how it works, how it affects people. And by the point in Thatcherism when he's making Christine, those institutions are gone from people's lives. Anything that could have helped someone like Christine in the years gone by, whether it's social services or the church or local government or the NHS, they're being pared back and sold off. And all you have in its place is what he's exploring in films like that and Elephant, which is just the sort of numbness of bad things happening.
The chasm of where things would have stepped in and now no longer there. I mean, it's very true. I mean, you're talking at a time when sort of like, for want of a better term, it's not particularly politically correct, but, asylums were then suddenly occurring, the communities coming into play. The things that you used to rely on in society are no longer prevalent. And he was very much an institutional filmmaker. I think somebody once called Kubrick an institutional filmmaker as well. And there's a certain overlap in their styles, I think, certainly with Steadicam and stuff like that. I mean, it'd be interesting to try and watch something like Sovereign's Company and then watch Full Metal Jacket to see what sort of way he's both looking at military life. He was definitely an institutional filmmaker, but at the point of the 80s, I think he's interested in the lack of institution or what institution has been replaced with. It's almost like the negative aspects of institutional sort of structures and foundations are now just society becomes this blob of institution. It's full of negative context. I mean, even with Rita Sumbob too.
There should be someone intervening in that situation.
Absolutely,
the people who watch it and hate Bob have a point.
If this was a Ken Loach film, there'd be social services at the end coming in to sort of like realize what's gone on. But this isn't. This is an Alan Clarke film, and it's played for laughs. Yes, it's very, very funny. But watching it now, certainly in the context of a very dear friend of mine who watched it and didn't like it particularly because of the sense of abuse that's going on there, and the sense of unequal ground between male and female characters. I see it too, absolutely, but I see it as a critique of patriarchal society that we continue to live in. But at the time in the 80s, it was even worse because, we didn't have that level of awareness as we see now with like characters like, Jimmy Savile, Stuart Hall, Rolf Harris. These were predators out in the open, and people would turn a blind eye because people thought, well, that's what goes on. And it's horrible to look at now, and it's interesting that George Costigan, who played Bob, one of his last big roles on television recently was as a paedophile police officer in Line of Duty, one of those great cinematic TV programs that the BBC are more keen on making now, with a Photoshop picture of him shaking hands with Jimmy Savile.
Oh, is that the one where they had the Jimmy Savile? Yeah, that was very odd, wasn't it? I remember that people talking about that when it was out.
It's really interesting to see how that plays, really, especially with Costigan apparently said that on set, talking to Clarke, Clarke apparently said to him, how do you see this panning out, this film. And he said, well, I don't know about you, but I want him to win. Because, you know, you're playing that part. You've got to invest a certain
You've got
empathy
to be a sort of advocate for your character, haven't you, even if they're awful? Yeah.
Exactly. And Clarke said, well, so do I. And I can see why Andrea Dunbar hated that, because, again, it's men getting one over on her.
Yeah.
But like I say, and I may be wrong, and I'm sure my friend in particular will pull me up about it. And I'm sure a lot of more feminist people than me, although I do consider myself to be a feminist, and more women who might listen to this podcast or watch this podcast might say, yeah, you're talking about your housemates, but I'll go with it. You know, I do see it as a critique of patriarchal society on the framework that we allowed things to go on at that time, with that kind of, oh, it's just a laugh, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that's definitely Dunbar's intention. I mean, my main, other than Reach Soon Bob 2, my main knowledge of Dunbar comes from one of my favourite British films of the century, which is Cleo Barnard's The Arbor. It's an absolutely incredible film,
fantastic film.
Tracks her life and her daughter's life and is just devastating. But, you know, her daughter's in some way identified with Rita and Sue. You know, her daughter said, if it was made now, their lives would be far much worse. They'd have that happen to them and they'd just get addicted to drugs or go into prostitution.
Exactly. And it's interesting, like you say, in the space of 2 years, he's made Christine, which could almost be, you know, what
they thought.
What Andrea's daughters would say was, you know, the outcome of that, really. But I mean, even though she had problems with the film, she herself must have known that society around her, the community in Leeds, must have just thought, oh, it's a laugh, isn't it? Good old Bob, you know, pat him on the back. Oh, you jammy bastard. That's that horrible attitude to sexual abuse, basically.
Yeah, and I'm sure she was familiar with that. Yeah, I agree. But the talk about sympathy is interesting because, of course, one of the other things you've got here is that the lead is not played by a very good character actor like George Costigan. It's an actual rock star. And that makes the question of audience identification and charisma into a very different thing, I think.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, because it's like whether Bowie fans coming to it will obviously just love Bowie. Yeah. So it is kind of like, well, he's got my vote straight away.
Yeah.
Whereas I'm coming to it thinking, even though I'm a Bowie fan, I'm coming to it thinking that's David Bowie playing a role, which I think is what Brecht would have appreciated from this production.
And
it's a visible presence.
There's elements of it that play into Bowie's persona in an almost metafictional way, almost as much as The Man Who Fell to Earth. It's just less on the nose, I guess, because The Man Who Fell to Earth is a great example of that because he's playing an alien, obviously. You know, what could be more Bowie? But if you go into David Bowie's early career, you can find all sorts of songs like Signet Committee and Quicksand, which express this deep unease about how an audience identifies with a rock star and whether there's maybe something a bit dictatorial about that. You know, you have Ziggy Stardust, who is an apocalyptically bad influence on the society that idolizes him and is destroyed by that society for that reason. And so, you know, there's an element of thematic consistency to that where part of you just wants to watch Baal and think, yeah, you know, those fucking toffs, go after them, make them look stupid, play all your dirtiest songs and make them drop their monocles. And then he like murders someone or molests an underage girl. And you think, oh, well, I should have seen that coming. That's a logical end point of the sort of person he is, the sort of person who I was cheering on, you know?
Yeah. And again, it's that, it just punches that mawkish sentimentality brilliantly, doesn't it? Because I mean, the minute he says, I live in a garret, or you live in a garret, don't you? And he says his address, you know, number something A, whatever, you know, that to this day has connotations, that romantic connotations of long-suffering artists scrabbling to get by on life. But they've got talent, they've got dreams, they've got ambition. But they could also be a fucking cunt, couldn't they? Which Baal clearly is. So that whole romantic stereotype is just punctured straight away by showing him at his most venal, really, isn't it?
Absolutely. And he looks repulsive. It's like it doesn't quite succeed in making David Bowie not sexy, but it gets closer than you'd think was possible.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that people say sort of like, Bowie, Thin White Dookie, and heroin chic and that kind of stuff. It's like, no, this is heroin. Look at the guy's teeth in this, the way they sort of like, it's a fantastic makeup job to get that horrible green. Ugh.
And it's one of the reasons why I think he is such a successful casting choice in this. I mean, there's another version of Baal made for German TV by Volker Schlondorf in the 70s.
Is this the one with Fassbender?
Yeah, it stars with Werner Fassbender.
I've not seen that.
I've not seen it. It was suppressed for a long time because Brecht's widow was unhappy with it. But I mean, just on the central casting choice, I don't want to fat shame Werner Fassbender, but I do not buy him as a starving artist.
No,
the artist part, he's got down pat. Don't get me wrong, but
he's a bit too quick to the buffet table, really.
He is a bit, yeah.
So I mean, that would slightly worse, isn't it? All right, if his mate opens up an exhibition, he's at the buffet table, but he's gone through a lot of buffets, hasn't he?
Yes.
So yeah, that kind of elegantly wasted look that Bowie was famous for is not there. It's more of a 40-inch wasted look, really.
Yes. But this is an interesting spot in Bowie's career, I think, that rarely gets analysed in the depth it does, because he's in a transitional period. He's just come out of his infamously exploitative contract with Main Man Records. He's going to release Let's Dance fairly soon. But in between, he's sort of playing around. He's doing a lot of different interesting things, of which this and the soundtrack to this are some of the more intriguing and the more, the ones that feel more like someone who's thinking, I'm going to do a big pop album, but before I do, let's see if I can sneak this in under the wire.
Yeah, I'm going to play around a bit, really, isn't it? But also, I think it's interesting that the 80s becomes his sort of decade for acting as well, isn't it? It's like he knows that he can put on roles, that his whole sort of like music career has been to adopt a role, shed it, create another role. And now he's seen a second opportunity to do that in a more condensed way of just, I've got 90 minutes of screen time to fill. I'll do a role. Because you think, I mean, what I still think to this day, my favourite Bowie performance is "Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence," which
fantastic,
I think is a fantastic performance. And anybody who says that he can't, he's not. I don't think he's an actor, but anybody who says he can't convince in a role hasn't seen that film, really.
Yeah, I would cite that as the most immersive thing that he's done. Certainly.
Yeah, and they all come relatively quickly from here on, don't they? Really, I think I'm not sure the exact dates, but I'm sure Merry Christmas was done about 84 or something like that, and this is about 82. So I mean, and then Labyrinth's about 86, isn't it? So they're all sort of coming relatively quickly.
And it's interesting that, it's interesting that it happens then, because, of course, another part of what happens as the 80s go on is that he hits his first serious wobble in his music career. And you can look at those 80s films and the soundtracks that came with them as being almost an alternative history of Bowie. If he wasn't making stuff like Tonight and Never Let Me Down, he is where his head was also at, that he could have been at.
Yeah, I think we take it for granted now, don't we? But it's like nobody knew that rock and roll had a lifelong career. You know,
Yes.
it wasn't meant to be something that you could maintain into your 50s or, you know, your mid 70s or whatever it is that the Stones are at now.
Yeah.
So these were like the first sort of generation to make a full lifelong career out of it. So I suppose Bowie hitting 40 is probably thinking, this might not last forever. I might have to sort of diversify into something else.
Yeah.
And you know, it's only right that it might be movies. And of course, he just done The Elephant Man, didn't he?
On
Before
stage,
going
yes.
to Baal. I think it was The Elephant Man that Marx sort of spotted him from, really, and thought, well, let's see if we can get him.
It was a big turning point in his career as an actor because, I mean, he'd been in The Man Who Fell to Earth, which is amazing. I adore that film, but it is based to a large part on his existing persona.
Yeah,
He'd been in Just a Gigolo after that, which was a major flop.
Yeah, not a good film at all.
No. And then suddenly he's in The Elephant Man, and that's a real transformative piece of acting. Famously, he did it without any prosthetics. He conveys Joseph Merrick's disfigurement and physical limitations purely through his own physical movements.
Physicality, yeah. It's all the best stuff he learned from Lindsay Kemp, really, isn't it? The whole sort of mime stuff, the idea of using your body as a performance tool.
My body is my tool.
Is a tool.
Yes.
Aim and mame. I genuinely did not mean to evoke Rowan Atkinson in Not the 9 o'clock news there, but as soon as I saw your face just go, I thought he's thinking of something. What have I just said? And he just came straight in with a quote. But yeah, I mean, I think you've hit something there when you said, like, you know, The Man Who Fell to Earth is based solely on his presence. I mean, it's cracked actor, isn't it? It's sat in the back of the limo with the fedora hat on. I mean, that's the biggest and best audition piece you can get for The Man Who Fell to Earth, really, isn't it?
And like, I mean, we'll be diving more into The Man Who Fell to Earth next week, but like this, it was not intended as a pop star vehicle. There were lots of quote unquote proper actors who were linked with it.
O'Toole was up for it, wasn't he?
O'Toole, Robert Redford was.
Right, okay.
Yeah,
that would have been interesting.
Yeah. But as soon as Bowie gets into it, it's obvious that Rogue has refashioned his ideas for the film around who Bowie is.
Yeah. And I mean, that's the interesting thing about Elephant Man and Baal, really, in the sense that they do not fit any of that elegant rock star look that he'd perfected for much of his career up to that point.
Yeah.
He is genuinely playing against type.
Yeah.
You know, to play John Merrick and then to play horrible, dissolute, rotten tooth artist. I mean, I think if he'd had a mind to it now in 1982 and he said, we want some jumped up artist who looks rotten, his teeth are awful, he thinks nothing of abusing people, you'd probably go for a punk, wouldn't you? You'd probably ask Johnny Rotten what he was doing that week, you know?
So... Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. And of course, Bowie was left alone. By the punk generation. You know, they never saw him as one of the kind of parents they needed to kill.
Yeah, I mean, he's sort of nicely exiled in Germany, wasn't he? Which again is an audition piece for this as well, really, isn't it? But he sort of escaped the wrath of punk's "Kill Your Darlings," really, didn't he? But in a way, I suppose that makes it more seamless for him to just adopt this guy straight away. Whereas,
you know, in the same way that the album he'd released before this, Scary Monsters, is very much him looking at the developing kind of synth pop and new romantic landscape and putting on a persona that reminds you who did it first. You can read Baal as being him applying the Scary Monsters template to punk in that way, I guess.
I think so, yeah. Interesting, yeah.
But the other major contribution this made towards Bowie's career is the soundtrack album he released, which is astonishingly good, I think.
Never heard it. Never heard it.
Ah, well, yeah, hide thee to YouTube where it's all been put up.
Right. I shall do
Because
that.
rather than the old one-string banjo arrangement that is,
Cling.
yes,
You
that's
may
in the
remember that
film.
from the beginning of this podcast, listeners.
Rather than that, he got Tony Visconti in to orchestrate it with like a German pit orchestra.
Oh wow! Because I
And
have seen it sort of, online a few times. I think, God, who wants to listen to that?
yes,
No, it's bad enough to watch it. I mean, that would be Baal X, really.
yeah.
What a load of old Baal X that would be. Never mind the Baal X.
Well, the film is like the Let It Be Naked version of what
Right.
Visconti put out. The Visconti stuff is beautiful.
That makes more sense now, yeah.
There's a version of Baal's hymn, which is the song that he comes back to and sings different verses of throughout the film, where it's all stitched together in one like 5-minute song with a full orchestra, and it's incredible. It's so good.
But I must say as well, anybody who sort of sits and watches Baal and think, God, this one chord, it's bloody awful. I mean, again, sometimes with Brecht, you've got to remember what context these things were, and it was cabaret. It was sort of like, it wasn't supposed to be all spit and polish and wonderfully presented. It was a bit rough and ready and a bit ramshackle and a bit interesting and subversive, I guess.
Yeah, and I
mean,
think
there's.
We could end in a lot of ways, but I think a bit interesting and subversive is a pretty good summation point for Baal, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. It's definitely. It's not my favourite by any stretch. It rates very low down on my appreciation of Clarke, really, but it's a must-watch, really. Yeah. I think, because if you're after something quite interesting and subversive, then this is the place to be.
And do listen to those Visconti recordings, because aside
I
from
will
anything else,
do,
some of Bowie's best vocal performances, the version of The Drowned Girl is chilling. It's so good.
Right. I shall get on to that. I shall get thee to YouTube, as you rightly recommended.
So, as we said, next week it's one of the all-time big hitters from Bowie's film career. It's The Man Who Fell to Earth. Yes, until next week, that's all from Pop Screen. I've been Graham.
And I have been Mark.
And we'll see you next week.